professor on the IRB, Devin Ketchum, has done these things before. And we're always streamlining the IRB process. And so it's like, here we are now. Trying to get your IRB applications in here. That's just a joke. So I've been on an IRB committee for 2-3 campus. And the people on the committee are completely dedicated to doing 2 things. The first is protecting human subjects. That's our primary job. And the second is not throwing unnecessary roadblocks in the path of researchers, because most of the people on the panel are researchers or have been researchers. I'll get into that in a little bit, but we know what it's like. We've all been through human subjects ourselves. Many of us continue to go through human subjects procedures ourselves with sending our stuff to different committees, right? So it's just like you all, this kind of nameless, faceless panel up there in the ether passing judgment on you, us too. So it's there's a lot of internal kind of feedback loops that happen with the people that sit on the committees and through our working with different investigators to help us think about ways to make the process more transparent, less onerous, but still provide the protections that we need to provide. So it's a work in progress always. So those of you who were in the inquiry class presentation that I did, there's some of the slides that you'll be familiar with, but since not everybody was there, I want to make sure I hit some of these important things. So who, what, where, when. Here, eager to watch requires that all research undertaken by faculty, students, or staff anywhere in the universe, so not just here, but if you're doing it in Zimbabwe, it still has to go through us if it's you and you're a student here. Students or staff involving human subjects must be reviewed and approved prior, that's the when part, to contacting potential subjects or beginning secondary data analysis. So you have to have prior permission. You can't just go and start contacting people and wait for your human subjects thing to go through the process. But why? Why do we need to do this? So the Belmont Report in 1979 was the work of a commission that was created by the National Research Act of 1974 after there were some egregious ethical violations in research that cost people their lives. I talked a little bit about the details of that in the inquiry class. I won't go into them here. But know that they were really awful and bad, and they had all kinds of awful and bad. It wasn't just one study, there were a number of studies. The one that was the real kicker was the Tuskegee syphilis study, and you may have heard of that, where poor African-American men with syphilis were denied treatment and not told that they had syphilis, and just watched until they died and infected all the partners and their kids and so forth. So pretty awful stuff. So anyway, whistleblower blew the whistle after 40 years on that study. And they decided that it was time for the federal government to get involved, and so they did. So they commissioned the Belmont Commission, who produced this report and identified basic ethical principles, also known as the common rule. So you'll sometimes hear people talking about the common rule. That's what they're talking about. So there's 3 aspects of basic ethical principles for research that are covered by the regulations and by the process. One is respect for persons, and by that we mean that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents who can agree or decline to participate at any point in the research process. And also additional protections for those with diminished autonomy. So that would be minors. People like prisoners in a position of, where they're in a position where it might be coercive to be asked to do research. People who are developmentally delayed adults, for example. People who have had head injuries or have suffered a stroke or any of those kinds of things that diminish capacity. Beneficence is the second principle, and that is really important in the process of evaluating someone's human subjects application. We want to make sure that there are the maximum possible benefits for the lowest possible risk to persons. So sometimes this gets talked about in shorthand as a risk-benefit analysis. That's what they're talking about when they mean that. So if subjects are incurring significant risk, it better be really an important study that's going to like change the universe. So things like clinical trials of drugs and things like that might really put people at risk. They're going to do things like keep the numbers small at first, have really specific protocols, pay real close attention, and try to do everything to minimize those risks. We don't get into that as much, but there are things that we do in the College of Education that are risky. So you can imagine things like people in school psychology who are studying suicide and suicide prevention. There might be some things there which put people at risk. People who are doing educational interventions, which you might not think would be all that risky, might possibly be risky. People who are doing education around health issues like HIV or drug use may find out things about kids, like that they have been involved in criminal drug use, and that they have to be protected from you outing them, as it were, right? Within the boundaries of our job to protect people from harming themselves or others. So there's all of those kinds of things. So just because we're in the College of Education doesn't mean that we don't have risks that we need to think about. Injustice. Who receives the benefits of the research and who bears its burdens? So that is one that it's evaluated on every application. It doesn't seem to me to come up all that often as a real serious problem. But basically, you'll have a set of questions on your application form that says, what steps have you taken to make sure you have equitable representation in your sample? So if you're doing a study that looks at the impact on girls of a certain intervention, obviously your subjects are all going to be girls, so they're not going to expect you to have half boys and half girls. But on the other hand, if you are, let's say you're really interested in teacher education, and so you want to study the teacher education students in the College of Education's teacher education program, because they're handy, and so do the other people in your methods of teacher education research class all want to study the same people, and so we start asking them to participate in a lot of studies, and that increases a burden where they're not probably going to get that much of a benefit, and so that kind of thing. Okay, applying the ethical principles. Here's how it plays out. Respect for person comes into play when we're talking about informed consent. You have to obtain it, you have to document it. Everybody on the panel looks at all of your forms. We look at them extremely carefully. It seems sometimes picky, but it's there for a purpose. Occasionally the purpose is to protect the university from legal action, but there's a few things in there about that. But mostly it's to make sure that what you're asking people is really clear, and what they're getting themselves into by saying that they'll participate in your research is really clear. So for example, if you have a survey and it covers lots of different topics, you would be expected to put in a couple of example items from that survey on the consent form, and it will be the most sensitive items you ask. So if you ask them about, when they started school and how long have they lived here, and what is their sexual preference, or what are how many drugs do they use on a regular basis, and you ask that kind of a range of questions, we're going to want the most sensitive ones that they might want to not answer to be in the informed consent, so that they know what they're getting themselves into. Even though you're going to be telling them that they can refuse to answer any question, just the fact that they've said yes to you puts them in a social context where they're going to feel a little bit of an obligation to answer your questions, and they may feel uncomfortable. So obtaining documented consent, this participation has to be voluntary, and there can be no coercion. So for example, if you ask a classroom teacher to ask kids to participate in your study, that could be coercive. And so a lot of times they're, depending upon the study and what is involved in it, that you'll have to document that you're protecting the students from the teacher knowing who's participating and who's not. Right, so we don't want there to be kind of like, if you participate, I'll give you extra credit points, unless that has been cleared, like it is with the psych students. And there's things that they can do that aren't researched that give them the same extra credit points. And so that's all very controlled and has been approved by the folks. But coercion may seem, it may not seem coercive to you, but it may seem coercive to the participant. And that's what we try to watch out for. Also, informed consent includes privacy protection. So especially if you're collecting any kind of sensitive data, if it's identifiable data, things like videotapes are inherently identifiable. And so you have to have some way to lock those away from the general public to protect the privacy of the participants. So we'll ask you about security measures. Beneficence, we talked about risk and benefits. The risks need to be reasonable in relationship to the benefits. And again, confidentiality can be a risk, depending upon what kind of data you have. And then justice in enrollment, make sure you either select participants equitably. We endeavor to oversample in this particular category of people because blah, 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 give a reason is fine. So if you have a reason for not having just kind of a random sample of everybody, you just explain the reason, and usually that's sufficient. Okay. Avoiding exploitation of vulnerable populations, we particularly watch out for that. And there are some additional forms you have to fill out when you work with kids, for example, that we'll talk about. So why does research require review? So this will be easy. So imagine you're a medical researcher and you're doing research on clinical trials on a new drug for strokes. What might come up that would fall under the category of subjects as autonomous agents in that kind of a study? What do you think?
Stroke victims often have speech impairments and can't always express themselves clearly.
Yeah, and cognitive impairments sometimes, and decision-making impairments, and so that's okay. So we'd have to think about that, and we'd have to have some way for that person to be protected. Okay. What about maximizing benefits and minimizing risks? New drug, stroke patients.
If you were unsure of the possible risks, you'd want to keep the sample small to begin with.
Right, right. And so you'd have to show if you're at the clinical trial stage, you'd have to show the IRB that you've done a bunch of studies before that to show that this is probably going to be safe. Right? So there's got to be evidence of that before you take this kind of stuff. And what about benefits and burdens?
Seems like that want the results of the trials to benefit or prevent those that are most at risk for having stroke.
Okay, okay. You could also think of it in terms of, you've probably heard of trials that were halted because either they discovered there was a problem that they didn't anticipate, or they discovered that it was so effective, the thing that they were trying, that they halted it so that more people could get access to it earlier. Okay, so that's like, do you run the whole study even though it's really clear from the early data that it's really, really beneficial? No, you probably don't, and that kind of gets looked at. Okay. So now, so that's medical research. What about educational research? So imagine you're studying, you're doing an intervention study on teaching reading. So what about subjects as autonomous agents? What kinds of things did you ever think about for that?
The age group
that the population of the students that you're dealing with, how old are they? Are they teenagers who read at a very, very low grade level, but they have more understanding of what they might get into themselves than, let's say, a second grader?
Mhm.
Something like that.
So if they're minors, you're going to have to probably have parental consent.
Mhm.
Okay, but you're also going to need assent from the kids. And so when you think about them as autonomous agents, and you're talking about kids who are young, or perhaps don't speak English as a first language, or perhaps have a cognitive impairment, you need to think about how are you going to communicate what it means to participate in the study in a way that they'll understand so that they can say whether or not they want to do it. Okay, so you have to think about, we look at not only the written forms, but we'll look also at scripts. So if you're working with kids who don't read, or can't read at the level that they would need to read to look at an assent form, then we'll want an oral script that would, where, of the words you will say to that student, and we can look at that and look and see if you're treating them as autonomous agents. Yeah.
And then I have a question, that's something I brought up on Friday last week. Is that also where it comes into play if you work with populations where in terms of multicultural vistas, you have kids who come from cultures where you as a researcher seem like the authority figure and they feel obligated to participate even though they may not want to. How are you going to tease that apart? How do you
Right, well,
account for
that's,
that?
right, so part of our job is to look for kind of indicators that might be a problem.
Mhm.
We do things, we look at, I'm on a social behavioral committee, so we don't look at the clinical trials for medicine. But we look at, it seems like almost everything else, anything that has to do with survey research or behavioral research in a medical sense and not. And so we look at a lot of HIV studies and a lot of, in a lot of different cultures around the world. And we look at studies of people's behavior in war zones, where there are some real risks involved, and who you're identified with as a researcher might come into play in whether they are going to feel at risk, and how are you going to protect them in that case. We had somebody who was doing research on how young activists use the internet in strife kinds of situations, and we had to think about, okay, so what kinds of protections are in place for the people who are participating so that they don't get outed by this. And it's like that took some backing and forthing to try to figure that out with the researchers. So anytime there are cultural kinds of issues, we try to notice that they might be, and we ask the researcher to explain the situation to us. So the researchers often are one of our best resources for figuring out what those cultural things are. And understanding how they're being thought about and dealt with in ways. And we also have people from, like my committee has a person who's an international student in law, who's on the committee as a citizen member, and she will raise questions, and other people on the, we have human subject staff that are on the committee, and they will raise questions. We've seen lots of this stuff before. So, but we often try to get more information from the researcher if we're not sure how to make that judgment. Okay, let's go on. I want to make sure we hit these two things because they're really important, because what you may be doing might not even have to go through the IRB. So the University of Washington is the same as you saw before, requires that all research is defined in a particular way, undertaken by faculty, students, or staff involving human subjects, which is also defined in a particular way, have to get prior approval. So let's look at these two things. Research. So research is a systematic investigation that is intended to increase the body of generalizable knowledge. So if you're doing a class project where the main point of it is to get your feet wet and try out some research methods or try out some assessment methods, and you're going to be working with individuals in order to collect some data, and you're going to analyze it, but it's for something that's going to pretty much stay here, then you're not doing research. IRB does not want to talk to you about that. So even in classes like the qualitative methods sequence, where everybody in the class does a project and they collect data and they have to go through a process that's almost identical to the human subjects process. It's all in-house. The instructors of the course serve as the IRB for that, because the primary purpose of that course, of the research activity in that course, is not to create generalizable research, but to teach people how to do qualitative research. Then, if you decide to go forward with that, so you started out in qual methods, and then you say, wow, this is really cool, I want to do my dissertation on it, I want to look at some of the same data, I want to collect some more data. At that point, you need to go through the human subjects process. But you can, if you're just using data that you collected in your qual methods study, you can ask to do it as secondary analysis, which is usually a minimal risk kind of a thing. And so they've set it up, they have worked this protocol with IRB to make sure that it places the least burden on IRB folks and the least burden on the students, but still enables people to go on with this, with the data that they collected if they want to. That's my understanding. Yeah, Louise?
So just on that point, because it seems to come up fairly regularly among students, if they do what you just described, they have a class project, and then later they decide that they do want to use that data for, say, their dissertation, are they going to have to go back and reconsent those subjects?
Not if the process that they went through for class was the same as they would go through before. So the way Mike Knapp explained it to me that they do for the qual methods course is that they have a procedure that's almost identical to IRB. So you have to do the consent forms and you have to do the whole thing as if you were going through IRB. It just doesn't go through that. So that way, if you go back later, you can show them the consent form that you used, and usually that is sufficient for you to be able to go forward. So in some cases, if you're collecting additional data that's not covered by that initial consent form, then obviously you'd have to reconsent for that. But if you're just using the data that you've already collected, you may not. Although we ran into something just this week, not on the board, but with a student that I was talking to who was asked to explain how they were going to recontact and reconsent minors who had completed data collection, were no longer actively involved in the study, to ask their permission to retain their data when they became 18. I have never seen that before, so I'm hoping that that was an aberration, but that was a new one on me. It was a big surprise. So occasionally, even those of us who have been sitting on these committees and seeing these things get surprised by what some other committee person decided needed to be done. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the program evaluation?
Yes.
If your dissertation is a program evaluation.
If your dissertation is a program evaluation, you may not have to go through human subjects. It depends on what kinds of data you're going to collect as part of the program evaluation. Right? So if you're going to be evaluating a program primarily by looking at documents and records and policies and test scores that are collected and you get them de-identified from the school so you never have access to who the kids are or anything like that, that kind of stuff is all not human subjects. You want to add to that?
No, I want to ask another question.
Okay, hang on, don't ask yet.
So, it's not exactly on that topic.
Okay, so, but if you're going to be interviewing people about, not about what the policy is, this is an interesting kind of gray area, but asking them their opinion about policy. What do you think about da-da-da-da-da? How effective do you think that this has been? Then you're collecting data by interacting with people, and it may well fall under kind of a minimal risk category for human subjects. So it just kind of depends on the data. Okay? Yeah, Louise.
So since a dissertation is considered a document that would be contributing to generalizable knowledge. In the
Yeah,
field,
but kind of by
typically.
definition. Because
Right, by
dissertations
definition.
have to do that.
Right. What about R&I?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So how would a student make the distinction between whether that was quote unquote research or not?
Well, you go back to the definitions. Is it systematic investigation that's going to increase the body of generalizable knowledge, or are you pilot testing a survey? So if you're pilot testing a survey, it's probably not gonna need to go through IRB as long as it's not asking sensitive questions that might cause ethical problems. Whenever you're not sure whether you qualify for this or not, the best thing that you can do is write out a clear kind of one paragraph description of what you're planning to do and email it to somebody over there in the Human Subjects Division in the tower. Because they can look at it and they can say things like, I would need more information, and then you can maybe call them and talk to them. But they can say, no, if you're doing this, it probably doesn't. So I do that. We collected some data in addition to some other data as kind of an add-on to a big study that we're doing where I was just interviewing people about what had happened, not their opinion about it, even though their opinions were volunteered sometimes in the conversation. The questions I asked were all about, tell me about how the principals have been changed, how often the principals have changed in this school, and how is that, tell me about your AP policy, and tell me about, how do kids get identified for AP. I'm asking them information about practices and policies in the school. I'm not asking for their opinion about any of that stuff. We thought we'd have to go through human subjects and get a modification, and they said, no, this isn't even human subjects data because it's policy stuff. So it just kind of depends on what you're doing. Yeah.
So if you do a class project and in retrospect you think that you would maybe want to take it for a publication, so what do you do?
So, well, if you do a class project and you think you can use that to do this, you can use those data. If you have consented them in a way that is agreeable to the folks over there as part of what you did, then that shouldn't be a problem. If you have not, if they say, well, you should have asked them this and told them that, then you may have to re-consent those people to use their data.
No, but so then, supposing you have followed the guidelines, do you go back to IRB and get it through them? Or if you've followed the procedures, then you just go ahead?
Go back. You have to, it has to be, because now you're doing research and not a class project.
Okay.
Okay, so it needs prior approval before you get to do that research, even though it's data you've already looked at, right? And then you need to get, so that needs to go through and get approved. Yeah.
And there's also, like, I did it for my IRB, I did it under an IRB from a different institution from Portland State. But in order to actually publish that research, I'm going to have to go through IRB at UW to publish and say I'm a student here. So it was okay for me to do the research because I had, I had another IRB that was fine. But like if I'm gonna publish, like absolutely UW has to agree.
Right, and there's actual procedures that they have for various ways that can play out. That for if it's approved, if it's a multi-institutional study, they'll say, okay, these guys are the primary IRB. It still has to go through ours, but if that IRB says yes, then we're going to say yes unless we see something really egregious, which we never do. So I have a study like that where I'm working with somebody from Oregon State, and it's their data, and so they're the primary IRB on it. But we had to get that noted by our IRB, and they had to see what we were doing. So anyway, that's all kind of maybe a level of detail beyond what you need at this point in time. There are always these little kinds of questions because these, whether or not it's research, whether or not it involves human subjects, are judgment calls. And there are pretty clear criteria for this, but that doesn't mean that you don't have some gray areas in there that you have to negotiate with IRB. Okay, so human subjects data are data that are about persons who are living. Usually, there's a small category of dead persons for whom we consider their data to be human subjects data too. But persons who are living, when data are identifiable, so there's some kind of identifier on their phone numbers, names, addresses, social security numbers, GPS locations, those can all be identifiers. There's lots of different kinds of identifiers. So if it's identifiable or if it's obtained through interaction or intervention, even if it's totally anonymous, that's still human subjects. Okay? So opinions, thoughts, memories, video records, audio records, interviews, any of those kinds of things general human subjects data, school or health records, immigration status, results of experiments or other kinds of interventions. Those are all data that, if collected from humans, or human subjects data. There's a whole nother set of things that, for animal research that I don't even find. So, because I know nothing about it. Here's some examples. So that's, you're going, okay, well, that's all, those are all examples of human subjects. What's not a human subject? This may be more informative. So, things that do not require human subject review. If you're examining published documents, not human subjects data, even if they're written by humans. Asking persons for factual information about institutions such as school size, number of teachers, what textbooks they're using, or interviews asking factual questions about district policy, those are not human subjects. De-identified data that you did not obtain through interaction or intervention are also not human subjects data. But if you, so some of you are involved in programs or projects where you have access to national databases. Those national databases have their own process that you have to go through that's human subjects like. But for our purposes, we don't consider those data since they're de-identifiable as human subjects for our purposes. But there's usually pretty rigorous kind of procedures you have to go through to get permission to access those data. Yes?
If I am planning on doing RNA presentation using the data that I got from other researchers, with used some synonym and if I'm not going to use this for publish, does it mean that I don't need to go through the IRB?
So if you got your research data from someone else and it's de-identified, so is it data that you can't see the people or hear the people, you don't have their names, you don't have anything like that, right? Then that's, you don't have to worry about it because that's not human subjects data. Okay? If it is identified, we'd be using audio tapes or videotapes, or you've got some other kinds of identifiers in the data, then you may be covered under their human subjects. I mean, talk to them, talk about that. Maybe in a modification, maybe not. But yeah, if it's not identifiable data, then you should be fine. Yes?
Even if the original researcher who collected the data has some link to the identities of those subjects?
As long as the person who's doing the presentation, who's getting the data and doing the analysis, doesn't have that access.
No links to
No
that.
links, right. So, for example, if you're an RA on a project and you have access to the file that has the identifiers in it, then you have to be covered under their human subjects approval in order to do that. Because you could go in and look up the kids that are in the study in some way, unless any identifying information, including a coded number or a pseudonym has been removed. And if that's the case,
During the case that I don't have intent to contact with a subject.
it doesn't matter if the data are identifiable, right? So if they're identifiable, you need to follow human subjects protocols for that. So when I have a bunch of survey data in the can from stuff that I have collected from previous studies, and sometimes I give access to those data to students who are doing projects in some quantitative methods class or something, or they might want to present it as an RNI project. If I give it to them with all of the identifying information stripped, or if they are not working on the project so they have no access to what those code numbers mean, I usually just take the code numbers right out. So the only thing that's in there is the responses to the surveys, then they're not worried about it because it's not identifiable. Okay. So, who are we? The IRB. The IRB is several different committees. There are 3 biomedical committees and 3 socio-behavioral committees, plus there's 1 committee that does both. I'm on a socio-behavioral committee and on committee general. But there's also Committee C and Committee G also do social behavioral stuff. And so when I put in an application, my stuff goes to C or G. It doesn't ever come to my committee. Each IRB includes researchers like me from across the university. It includes Human Subjects Division staff as voting members. There's usually, they've got 2 voting members from agency staff. And it includes 1 or more community members who are not researchers and not Human Subjects Division staff. They could be students at the university, but just not researchers. And those folks are there to represent possible participants in their view, right? So we like it when there's somebody from the law school that comes and volunteers to be on the committee because they bring a really nice set of parameters with them that they're familiar with. But any interested community member can volunteer for this, and any one of you can sit in on an IRB meeting and actually watch us do our job. And we almost always have 2 or sometimes 3 observers who are just there to learn about the process, and you're more than welcome to do that. So it's everything that you hear there is confidential, so you can't go back and talk about the really interesting study that they talked about at the IRB meeting, which is hard sometimes because they're really interesting studies, but we can't talk about that outside the room. Okay.
Excuse me, Sue?
Yes.
So, and when you talk about the committee, you talk about the committee that reviews applications, not the minimal risk applications and not exempt applications.
Right, and I will get to that in a minute.
Okay.
Okay, so this is what's called the full committee. So if you go through a full committee, it goes through one like that. And I'll talk about the kinds of committees. So, so this is pretty much what we talked about. So our job is to make sure that the common rule is followed, and we look at all 3 of those categories, and they mostly are informed consent kinds of things for respect for persons, beneficence, risk versus benefits, and equitable participation and benefits under justice. Remember this, all of the information that you provide in your lengthy human subjects application enables us to decide whether you're following the common rule. We don't ask any extraneous questions. So you'll look at it and go, that doesn't apply to my research. There's probably a box that says does not apply to my research, and you check that box. Okay, so you'll see the same form that somebody who's doing a clinical trial will see, and there'll be stuff in there like radiation, genetic material, and you'll go, my God, why am I doing this? Just check it off. It's not applicable. Move on. All right. So, potential benefit to individuals, potential risk benefit analysis. This is kind of at the core of what we look at, risk benefit. So sometimes we'll see something and we'll say, that's lousy research. And we have to decide whether that impacts the risks and benefits, right? So if somebody's got a really poor design, or they've got a fatal flaw of some description, or they're really not gonna find anything out. In rare cases, we will kick it back and say, this is so poorly designed, and then because of this flaw and this flaw and this flaw, we don't think you're gonna get any useful information, and so we can't see why we should put people through participating in your study, because it's not gonna get you anything. It doesn't happen very often, but occasionally it does happen. But sometimes we just see things like, wow, they should have done it this way instead of that way, but it's not fatal. It's not like, doesn't make their information worthless. It just makes it not as good as it could be. We have to pull ourselves back as researchers and say, it's not our study. It's not part of our job to decide whether it's the best study that it could be, and so we don't do that. So, but sometimes it's really hard. The faculty signature, you have to get a faculty signature if you're a student when you put in an IRB application. This is your advisor, generally speaking. And their job is to assure that the scholarship is good, that it's potentially beneficial to do this research. That means they have to read it. Not every faculty member always reads these things terribly carefully. Make them do it, because otherwise, whatever mistake that they could have caught for you and you could have fixed in 5 minutes is going to take a month, because it had to go to the IRB and come back to you. Right? So it's really in your best interest, and especially the first time you do one of these, make an appointment with your advisor and say, can we sit down and go through this together? I've filled it out. I'm not sure I've done it correctly, but could you walk through with me step by step, and we can do it. And even very busy people should be willing to do that. Note that potential risks can be of various types. They're not always physical risks, but they can also be emotional risks. They can be economic risks. If someone finds out that I participated in this study, I'll get fired from my job, right? They could be professional risks. If someone reads your study and somebody said this bad thing about the school, they're going to know it was me, and that's going to cause me problems. You know, there are those kinds of risks that we have to look at as well. We also look for, particularly for vulnerable populations issues, for college of ed folks, it's often because the people are children. Power issues that might result in coercion. So we'll ask you to be very specific about how you are approaching and recruiting subjects to make sure that there's no coercion, and to make sure that subjects can really do the homework. I mentioned risks associated with a breach of confidentiality, identifiable data like video and things with people's names and other kinds of identifiers on it have to be protected. And so we'll ask you if it's on an external hard drive that's password protected, in a locked office, in a locked drawer kind of stuff. And with protected health information and other kinds of stuff that's really, really risky, we ask for even more than that. But basically, there has to be a way for you to make this data not available to people outside the study. Yes?
I have a question about coercion and compensation. Is it ever the case that the amount of compensation or the nature of the compensation being offered is considered
Coercive?
That's potentially coercive if
Yes.
you're working with
Absolutely.
low-income populations?
Absolutely
So-
right. Yeah, so you have to use something that, usually what we say is that if you pay people a reasonable amount per hour for their time, that's usually a good way to do it. If it's something fairly small, like a $25 Starbucks card, or something that's not very much money, that's fine. But if you go into, say, a high poverty school district and you offer to pay kids $150 or $200 to participate in your study, you better have a really good reason for that and for why you're paying them that much money, because otherwise it is coercive. So yeah, we look at amounts and stuff, and we even look at things like, we had one study that was collecting data in multiple countries, and they were going to give us Starbucks card, and we thought, well, but where's Starbucks? Is the Starbucks card even worth the same amount in different countries? Because in some countries, Starbucks charges like huge amounts of money for coffees that they don't charge quite so much for in the U.S. And so then it's like, if you get the same dollar amount, is it really the same equitable compensation across all the populations? So, and if you've got different kinds of subject groups, you have to think about, are you offering reasonable compensation across those groups so that no one group is advantaged over any of the other groups participating in your study? Yeah.
I have a question about video. I've always wanted to sort of kill two birds with one stone and take video for whatever study that I'm doing, but then also ask the participants if they'd be willing to let me use that in future teacher education courses.
Yes, you can do that. And in fact, if you're planning to do that, you need to do that.
Right. Yeah.
So
I
we
would be
have
able to. Yeah, but
So if you're using video and you want to show it for conferences in your presentation, you want to use it for teacher ed classes, I would recommend that you have a separate consent or assent line for each purpose for which you're possibly going to use the video. And that way they can check one is okay and one is not okay, and it doesn't blow you out of the water. Right? You can still use them in your study if you want to. But yes, you can use it for research, but no, I don't want you to use it in a presentation. Okay, I won't use you. I'll use somebody else. Okay, but
Thank you.
if you break that out, then they're able to do that.
right.
Okay, there's 3 types of review. Full committee we've talked about. Minimalist risk review is a staff-only review. Frankly, it takes pretty much the same amount of time and sometimes more time if you send it through minimal risk. So I would say, unless you know for sure that you're doing a minimal risk study, which is defined as no more than the risk involved in normal daily life officially, but in actual fact, it's pretty subjective how that's defined, I think. If you know, if you're doing, like, for example, you're going in and you're handing out an anonymous survey and the kids are mailing it back in envelopes you've provided, and there's no names on it and everything, that's pretty minimal risk. That'll probably go through with no problem, as long as the survey items are not real risky themselves. I just had a student who went through minimal risk, and after 3 months of going back and forth with a minimal risk person, it got bumped up to full committee. Not because it was inherently risky, but because his design was really complicated. And there were enough questions where, okay, well, now that you've explained this, I understand that, and now I have this question, kind of thing, that they just sent it up. But know that the Human Subjects Division is in the process, has been for about a year in the process of trying to figure out how to make the minimal risk full board decision more consistent and predictable. And so they've made some joint committees so that there's the same staff members working on both committees and maybe being able to identify where that line is between minimal risk and full board more clearly. But that's also in progress. Yes.
So I think that's a really important thing for everybody to know, because it seems to me it's one of the hardest things for the researcher to determine whether this is minimal risk or something greater than that. So could you give us a little more information on how that happens? I mean, how it works so I complete my application and I have the opportunity to check a box saying this is minimal risk or not, right? And I send it in, and it gets to somebody over there in Human Subjects Division, and then what?
Okay, so it goes to the minimal risk subcommittee, which is all HSD staff people. It's not the people from full board. And they read it through, and they screen it, and they usually will send it back to you and say, I have these questions, and you answer those questions, and then it goes back to them. And if it's indeed minimal risk and you've answered all the questions, then they check it off, and you are approved for a year, just as if you've gone through the whole board. It's a way to try to keep the full board from having to look at studies that really aren't very complicated that a staff member could go through. If you are at all unsure about whether your study qualifies for minimal risk, if you've got a complicated design, or if you're asking some questions on your survey that might be seen as a little risky, or you're doing a lot of videotaping, or anything else like that, you're working with kids, that's a flag, then I would say send it in, don't check the minimal risk box. And then if it turns out to be minimal risk, it's not going to take you any more time to have gone through the full committee. But they'll say, this is really minimal risk, so next time send it through minimal risk, and they'll put that in the notes, and then when it comes back, when you do your annual re-up, it won't go back to the full committee, it'll just go to the minimal risk people. But maybe in the future the timeline will be different, but right now it's the average time to go through human subjects is 4 to 6 weeks, regardless of whether you do minimal risk or full board. So, and that's the average time. Know that, that's the average time, and some of them are longer. I'm not going to talk about exempts because I think that I'm just not going to do that. Okay, so I want to give you some tips before we finish up. I mean, we're at 15 minutes into this, so I don't want to go too much longer and still leave you some time for additional questions. So here's some tips for completing your applications. Deb McCutcheon calls this CNC, clarity and completeness. Don't use jargon. Do not cut and paste from your master's thesis proposal into your human subjects form. We are not your advisor. We are just people who don't maybe know very much about your theoretical framework and don't want to know very much about it. And so be clear, don't use jargon, use simple active declarative sentences instead of long, wandery, multi-clause ones with passive voice in them. Just think of us as not too bright 8th graders. Do not leave any question unanswered. This is critical. I don't see very much of this anymore, but occasionally we'll, and usually they get caught on screening, so before I ever see it as an IRB member, it's been caught. And people have been asked for information. But don't leave any question unanswered. There's always a box for not applicable if that's an option. Sometimes instead of not applicable, it will say, tell us how you're doing this or tell us why you shouldn't have to. something like that, tell us why you shouldn't have to, and then we'll leave you alone. Attach everything that a subject will see or hear. So that includes all your consent forms, obviously. It also includes recruitment flyers, web advertisements, if you're advertising for surveys, screenshots, if you have an intervention that's delivered on a computer, give us an example screenshot that shows us what the intervention looks like so we can judge that. If you're giving a survey, we need a copy of the whole survey. If you're doing a semi-structured interview so that you can't predict the exact questions that you're going to ask because it depends on what the person says back to you, then give us your kind of outline. What are the 5 main questions that you're going to ask, and then what are some possible follow-ups to those, and then explain that it's a semi-structured interview and it may go a little beyond that, and that's usually fine. Yeah.
If you're gonna do multiple interviews over time, and some of the latter ones will be informed by what you see, or how do you handle that?
There's 2 ways to do that. One is to explain that, and then try to predict and describe what that might look like. If you can do that, and it's pretty simple to do, that's fine. Another way that takes a little more work, but might be better in some cases, is to say, I will submit a modification that has the new interview questions in it before I do the second and the phase 2 interview or the phase 3 interview. And that's a good way to do it. If what they tell you on the first one is going to really change kind of what you're going to do, you'll be able to do that. Modifications don't take very long to go through. So, okay. Debriefing scripts, if you have any kind of deception in your study, like you don't want to let people know that this first little screening survey that you call a screening survey is actually your main measure, because you're going to do some sort of little manipulation to see what happens. It can be very innocuous, but if there's any kind of deception, you have to have a debriefing script where you explain the deception to the participants, and so forth. I'm going to flip the next slide, and then I'm going to come back and just show you what the form looks like so that you can kind of see what it does for you, because that's really nice modifications to the form that make it more friendly. I just want to point this out. The second tip is really pay attention to your consent and assent forms and the process that you're going to use for recruitment, because they're going to want to know about that in detail. And it's good, because if you have to specify it for us in detail, you also get clearer about how you're going to do it. And so it's actually a good thing. Consent or assent. Consent is for people who are over the age of 18 and mentally competent. Assent is for people who have some sort of cognitive impairment, temporary or permanent, that means that they aren't really able to consent for themselves, or anybody under 18. Occasionally, 16 and 17-year-olds we can do a waiver of consent for them because they're old enough to make decisions about blah, blah, blah. They have to be informed in understandable language. Consent or assent must be freely given. Consent or assent can be withdrawn at any point. They can call you up and say, take my survey out of your pile. I decided I didn't want you to know those things that I told you in the interview. Please delete that. They need to be able to do that. Use the templates on the HSD website. They have templates. They're there for a reason. They've been vetted by the lawyers. There's some legal language in there that if you don't have it, they're going to send it back to you. At the same time, even though the legal language is really jargony and really hard to understand, they're going to ding you if your language that you put in that consent form is not easy to understand. And so, to be clear,
I have a question about
Yes.
that for assent. So if I'm working with people, let's say with about they're teenagers, but let's say they're about 4th grade reading level. Now, I got confused because I felt like I needed to cut and paste the stuff from the HSD website that you use for the consent form, but it sounds like for the assent form, I don't need to use that same
right, you need to
language.
have the elements of elements of consent, so they need to know what they're getting themselves into. They need to know that they can withdraw their assent at any time. They need to know how you're going to protect the data. Those kinds of things need to be in there, but in really simple language or language that's appropriately simple for the people that you're communicating it to. If they can read, even if poorly, you probably want to have a written version of that, and you probably also want to have an oral script that you use. So, okay? If you are working with people who speak a language other than English, just a note, submit all of your materials, consent forms, and everything in English. Once we've worked you through it and it's approved, then translate it and send us the translation. But don't bother to pay somebody to translate it into 5 languages when you're going to have to change things because human subjects said, no, you need to change this, this, and this. Okay, so the translation part is always the last step for this. Okay, so let me go back. Well, let me do one more slide. Help with the process. The HSE website actually has a ton of information that gets you about halfway in. So when you're first starting out, it's good to go there and read what they have to say. A lot of it's similar to what I said today. Once you get into looking for documents, sometimes you have to kind of know what you're looking for in order to find it, and so you may need a little help with that. If you look for on the training tab on the HSD site, one of the things you can do is a CITI training. It's free, it's web-based, it takes about an hour. If you're doing NIH-funded research or you're working for somebody who's doing NIH-funded research, you need to do this. Otherwise, it's just a good way to learn all about human subjects. It's more detailed than what I've talked about today, and so that's a good thing. It's free and a resource. When you get done, you get a little certificate that says you have completed this and it's good for ever. So I did it, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, and mine's still good. So, current forms and policies. There is a standard operating procedures document for research on students that's it's available on the website, and it gives you all the really good information about if you're going to be working with students, here are the things you need to think about. And I noted to them that that's the one thing that doesn't have a live hot link on the form, on the main human subjects form, like everything else does to the document, and they're going to put that link in, but they may not have done it yet. They promised it to me by the end of the month. Your faculty advisor, very important resource for you. Make them read it through and talk with you about it, give you suggestions based on their experience. Louise Klaus in the back of the room. Louise is wonderful. She's the person you turn your forms into. Her office is in 115 in Miller, and she will get the dean's signature or his representative and so forth for you. But she will also screen it for completeness. So she's a good resource. If you have a question about human subjects, try asking Louise. She very well may know the answer. No.
Quick clarification question. Students means high school, elementary school?
No, students mean students.
Every student, so even students?
Teacher ed students.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
because there are those coercion issues that you have to think about. And me. Although I'm going back on sabbatical again next quarter, so don't bug me then. But this quarter I'm here, so you can ask me questions. All right, let me go back just really quickly and show you the form. I'm not going to go through it with you, obviously, but I'm just going to show you a few interesting things, maybe if it will let me. Okay, so this is what it looks like. It's available. It's easy to find them.